Imagine a wealthy Southern belle in antebellum New Orleans entangled in a forbidden passion with her enslaved manservant, a passion that led to the birth of their secret child. But to protect her pristine reputation, she made the unthinkable choice, selling her own flesh and blood into eternal bondage. This isn't fiction, it's a chilling true tale from America's darkest era that exposed the twisted heart of slavery and shattered a city's elite society. Stick around as we uncover the shocking details backed by real historical records that will leave you questioning the depths of human desperation. The summer of 1852 in New Orleans had been particularly stifling. Those who could afford to had already retreated to their country estates, seeking relief from both the heat and the epidemic of yellow fever that had begun to claim lives with alarming regularity. Yet at number 24 Bourbon Street, the Beaumont residence remained occupied, its windows tightly shuttered, despite the oppressive humidity that hung in the air like a burial shroud. According to tax records of Orleans Parish, the property had been purchased by Henry Beaumont in 1837, a merchant who had made his fortune in the textile trade between New Orleans and Liverpool. The records show that upon his death in 1850, the property passed to his only daughter Amelia, then aged 28 and unmarried, an unusual circumstance for a woman of her standing and age in New Orleans society. The New Orleans Crescent Society pages from 1847 through 1851 make occasional mention of Miss Beaumont attending various functions, though several accounts describe her as reserved and particular in her associations. The events that would later cast a shadow over Bourbon Street began. According to courthouse records, on July 15, 1852, when Amelia Beaumont registered the purchase of a new enslaved person, a man named Elijah Grant. What is known with certainty is that by 1852, Amelia Beaumont lived alone in the residence save for a household staff of 8 enslaved individuals. The transaction was handled by the firm of Harrington & Cumbers, one of the largest slave trading operations in the city. What makes this purchase unusual was not the act itself, but rather the price paid. Parish records indicate that Beaumont paid $550 for Grant, nearly double the typical price for an enslaved field worker at that time. More curious still was that Grant was not a field worker at all. Documents recovered from Harrington & Coba's ledgers describe him as literate, aged 31 years, suitable for domestic service, previously employed as manservant to Colonel Robert Caldwell of Mobile, Alabama. Why Miss Beaumont would pay such a premium for a domestic servant when she already maintained a full household staff remains one of the first questions in this troubling narrative. It should be noted that in the social climate of 1852, New Orleans interactions between white women of standing and enslaved men were strictly governed by unwritten but rigid codes of conduct. Enslaved men were almost never permitted to serve directly as valets or personal attendants to white women. Yet parish records from St. Louis Cathedral indicate that Reverend John Whitaker, during his regular pastoral visits to the Beaumont residence that summer, observed that Grant appeared to serve as Miss Beaumont's personal attendant, a fact he noted as unusual but not unprecedented given the lady's eccentric nature. Dr. Edward Sinclair's medical log, preserved in the New Orleans Medical Society archives, shows that he was called to the Beaumont residence on September 4th of that year. The reason for the visit was recorded simply as female complaint, a common euphemism used by physicians of the era when treating women for any number of conditions that propriety forbade naming explicitly. What makes this visit noteworthy is that it was the first of 25 visits Dr. Sinclair would make to the residence over the next 8 months. According to testimony later given by Mary Thompson, an enslaved cook in the Beaumont household, Miss Beaumont began to withdraw from social engagements entirely by late September. Thompson's account, recorded during the subsequent investigation, states, Miss Amelia ceased to receive callers entirely save for the doctor and the Reverend. She gave instructions that the drapes were to remain drawn at all hours and that no one was to enter the east wing of the house except for herself and the new man Elijah. The New Orleans Crescent Society pages from October through January of 1853 contain no mention of Amelia Beaumont at any social function, an absence that would have been noted in a community where social obligations were treated with the utmost seriousness, particularly for a woman of her standing. A letter from Mrs. Sophia Harrington to her daughter in Boston, dated November 1st, makes passing reference to this absence. The Beaumont girl has become positively reclusive these past months. There is talk that she has developed some nervous condition, though Dr. Sinclair remains discreet on the matter. Some speculate that her father's passing has finally affected her mind, delayed though such a reaction might seem. Winter in New Orleans brought no change to the strange stillness that had settled over the Beaumont residence. The only regular visitors were Dr. Sinclair, whose visits increased in frequency to twice weekly by February 1853, and Reverend Whitaker, whose parish records indicate he called upon the household every Sunday after services to bring communion to Miss Beaumont, who remains indisposed. What transpired within the walls of 24 Bourbon Street during those months was the subject of much speculation among the neighboring households. Eliza Johnson, an enslaved house servant at the adjacent property, would later testify that she often heard weeping late in the night, though whether it was Miss Beaumont or some other woman I cannot say with certainty. More troubling were the accounts of Samuel Wright, a free black night watchman who patrolled street. In his statement to authorities in 1854, he claimed that on 3 occasions between December 1852 and March 1853, he observed a tall male figure moving between the main house and the carriage house in the dead of night, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of some weight. When questioned further, Wright stated that he had assumed it was household business of no concern to me and had not reported the sightings at the time. The most significant entry in Dr. Sinclair's medical log comes on April 12, 1853. The typically sparse notes contain an uncharacteristically detailed entry. Attended Miss Beaumont for the final phase of her female complaint. Mother and child appear in good health considering the circumstances, have administered the usual tonic and recommended complete rest. The situation remains confidential as per agreement. This entry represents the first documented evidence that Amelia Beaumont had been pregnant and had given birth to a child in the antebellum South for an unmarried woman of Amelia's social position. Such an event would have been ruinous not merely to her reputation, but to her entire standing in society. The father's identity would have been a matter of grave concern, particularly in a community obsessed with bloodlines and racial purity. No birth certificate or baptismal record exists for any child born to Amelia Beaumont. However, the parish registry of St. Louis Cathedral contains an entry dated April 19, 1853, recording the baptism of infant male child Samuel, born to household servant Lydia. Lydia was one of the enslaved women owned by the Beaumont household described in property records as aged 26 years domestic worker. Here the historical record offers the first of several deeply troubling contradictions. Mary Thompson testimony given in 1854 explicitly states Lydia had not been with child. There was no way she could have had a baby. Miss Amelia told us that Lydia would be caring for her sister's child who had been sent from the country after the sister died of fever. But we all knew Lydia had no sister. By May 1853, according to the account of Sophia Harrington in a letter to her daughter Amelia Beaumont, had emerged from her mysterious seclusion and had begun to make occasional appearances in New Orleans society once again. Mrs. Harrington noted that Miss Beaumont appeared altered, somehow thinner certainly, but with a strange intensity about her that some find discomforting. The New Orleans Crescent of June 16, 1853, mentions Miss Beaumont's attendance at a benefit concert for the orphans of the yellow fever epidemic. The brief social note adds that Miss Beaumont has generously pledged $120 to the care of children left parentless by the recent epidemic, a substantial sum that reflects well on her Christian charity. What happened behind the closed doors of the Beaumont residence between April and October of 1853 is largely a matter of conjecture. The testimony of household servants provides only fragments of the reality. Eliza Davis, an enslaved laundress in the household, later testified that there was a baby in the house kept in the east wing, but we were forbidden to speak of it or to enter that part of the house. Miss Amelia and Elijah were the only ones permitted to care for it. According to household accounting books recovered during the subsequent investigation, Amelia Beaumont made a series of unusual purchases during this period. Imported English baby clothes from Fraser and Company, a silver christening cup from Hayden Brothers Silversmiths, and perhaps most tellingly, a customized miniature portrait locket from Mono Jewelers. The receipt for this last item, dated July 27th, specifies 2 portrait settings with inscription as directed. On October 12, 1853, Amelia Beaumont made an unexpected visit to the offices of Caldwell and Associates, one of New Orleans' most prominent legal firms. According to the firm's appointment book, she spent over 3 hours in consultation with senior partner George Caldwell. What transpired during this meeting would not become clear until much later. 2 days after this meeting, the New Orleans Courier's classified section contained a notice that would later prove significant. For sale, healthy female domestic servant aged 26 years, with male infant child aged 7 months. Excellent house servant trained in fine cooking and needlework. Selling due to household reduction. Inquiries to be directed to Caldwell and Associates attorneys. The female domestic servant was Lydia, and the male infant was the child who had been baptized as Samuel 7 months earlier. What makes this advertisement particularly significant is that it represents the first documented instance of what was known in the antebellum of the time as a fancy sale. The sale of an enslaved woman with her child, marketed specifically to buyers with certain proclivities. According to the firm's transaction records, Lydia and the infant were purchased on October 21st by William Hargrove, a wealthy planter from Jefferson Parish, for the sum of $1,000, an extraordinarily high price that, as several historians have noted, suggests Hargrove understood he was purchasing something beyond mere domestic help. What Amelia Beaumont could not have anticipated was that her carefully constructed narrative would begin to unravel just weeks after the sale was completed. The catalyst was Elijah Grant, who had remained in the Beaumont household throughout these events. Parish sheriff records indicate that on November 10, 1853, Elijah Grant was apprehended attempting to board a northbound vessel bound for New York. In his possession was found the sum of $250, a fortune for an enslaved person, and a letter addressed to the New York Anti-Slavery Society. The contents of this letter were suppressed at the time, but would later prove crucial to understanding the events at the Beaumont residence. Grant was immediately imprisoned in the New Orleans workhouse on charges of attempted escape and theft. According to the jailer's log, Amelia Beaumont visited him there on November 12th and engaged in what was described as a heated exchange. Following this visit, Grant was placed in solitary confinement, ostensibly for insolent and threatening behavior toward his mistress. What happened next suggests a calculated attempt to silence Grant permanently. Court records show that on November 14th, Amelia Beaumont filed formal charges against Grant, accusing him of theft of household valuables and attempted assault upon her person. Such accusations, particularly the latter, were effectively a death sentence for an enslaved man in antebellum Louisiana. Yet the case took an unexpected turn when George Caldwell, the very attorney who had handled the sale of Lydia and the infant, came forward with a startling revelation. According to court transcripts, Caldwell testified that Amelia Beaumont had consulted him regarding the legal implications of a child born to a white woman, but claimed to be born to an enslaved woman for purposes of concealment and subsequent disposal. Caldwell further testified that he had advised Miss Beaumont that such an action would constitute fraud in the sale of property, as well as potentially more serious crimes, depending on the circumstances of the child's conception. He claimed that he had refused to participate in the scheme, but that Beaumont had proceeded without his assistance, merely using his firm's name in the newspaper advertisement. This testimony immediately transformed what had appeared to be a straightforward case of an enslaved person's attempted escape into something far more complex and scandalous. Judge Benjamin Foster, presiding over the case, ordered an immediate investigation into the allegations regarding the child's parentage and sale. The investigation quickly focused on recovering the letter found in Elijah Grant's possession when he was apprehended. This document, entered into evidence on November 22nd, contained Grant's account of the events at the Beaumont residence. In it, he claimed that he had been purchased specifically because Amelia Beaumont had developed an unnatural attraction to him, and that she had compelled his intimate company through threats of severe punishment or sale to the sugar plantations of Mississippi. Grant's letter went on to state that Miss Beaumont had become pregnant and had concealed her condition from New Orleans society. After giving birth, she had forced Lydia to claim the child as her own, with the intention of later selling both mother and child to remove any evidence of her indiscretion. Most damning of all, Grant's letter claimed that the child born of this union bears upon his left shoulder a distinctive mark identical to one upon my own person, passed down through my maternal line. This claim of the identifying birthmark provided investigators with a means of verifying Grant's allegations. Judge Foster issued a writ ordering William Hargrove to produce Lydia and the infant for examination. Hargrove initially resisted, but complied when threatened with charges of obstruction. The medical examination conducted on December 1, 1853 by Dr. Sinclair, the same physician who had attended Amelia Beaumont during her confinement, and two other doctors from the New Orleans Medical Society, confirmed the presence of a distinctive birthmark on the infant's left shoulder. Dr. Sinclair, when confronted with his own medical logs documenting his treatment of Miss Beaumont, acknowledged under oath that he had indeed delivered her child and had been paid a substantial sum to maintain silence on the matter. The revelation that an unmarried white woman of high social standing had borne a child by an enslaved man and had then attempted to sell the child created what the New Orleans Crescent described as a scandal unparalleled in the recent history of our society. The case touched on the deepest fears and taboos of antebellum Southern culture. Miscegenation, the undermining of racial hierarchies, and the corruption of white feminine virtue. The legal proceedings that followed were extraordinary. Amelia Beaumont was charged with fraud in the sale of the child, perjury in her accusations against Elijah Grant, and what court documents delicately termed moral crimes against the natural order. Elijah Grant remained in custody, but was now held as a material witness rather than as an accused criminal. The most significant legal question, one that had few, if any, precedents in American jurisprudence at that time, concerned the status of the infant. If the child was indeed born to Amelia Beaumont, a free white woman, then under the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, that which is brought forth follows the womb, the child would legally be considered free, regardless of the father's status. Yet this same child had been sold as enslaved property, creating a profound legal contradiction. As the case proceeded toward trial in early 1854, New Orleans society found itself divided. Some prominent families, including the Harrington and the Rutledges, withdrew their support from Amelia Beaumont entirely. Others, however, closed ranks around her, suggesting that she had been corrupted and coerced by Elijah Grant, inverting the actual power dynamic between enslaved and enslaver. What might have become a landmark case never reached its full conclusion in court. On February 6, 1854, Amelia Beaumont was found dead in her bedchamber at 24 Bourbon Street. The coroner's report listed the cause as consumption of laudanum in quantities sufficient to cause cessation of breathing, a common 19th century euphemism for suicide by opium overdose. Found beside her body was a sealed letter addressed to Reverend Whitaker of St. Louis Cathedral. The contents of this letter have never been made public. Church records indicate only that Whitaker requested and received permission to place it under seal in the church archives to remain unopened for a period of 50 years, after which time the persons named therein shall have passed from this earthly realm. With Amelia Beaumont's death, the criminal case collapsed. Elijah Grant was returned to the status of enslaved property, now belonging to Henry Beaumont's estate. In what some viewed as an act of mercy, and others as an attempt to bury the scandal deeper, Grant was purchased by a consortium of New Orleans merchants and transported to Liberia as part of the American Colonization Society's resettlement program. No further record of his life exists in American archives. The fate of Lydia and the infant Samuel proved equally complex. William Hargrove, perhaps sensing the legal ambiguities surrounding the child's status, sold both mother and child to a planter in Mississippi, effectively removing them from New Orleans jurisdiction. Despite efforts by some members of the New Orleans Anti-Slavery Society to locate them, they disappeared into the vast, brutal system of American chattel slavery. 24. Bourbon Street remained unoccupied for nearly a decade following Amelia Beaumont's death. Local lore, recorded by folklorist Eliza Harrington in 1869, claimed that no New Orleans family would consent to reside in a home marked by such unnatural occurrences. The property was finally purchased in 1863 by a merchant from Boston who, being new to New Orleans, was perhaps unaware of its history. In 1904, during renovations to the east wing of the house, workers discovered a small sealed compartment behind a false panel in what had been Amelia Beaumont's bedchamber. Inside was found a silver locket containing two miniature portraits, one of Amelia Beaumont herself, and one of a male infant with striking eyes that, according to the contractor's written account, bore an unsettling resemblance to the portraits of the lady herself. The inscription inside the locket read simply, "My heart divided against itself, A.B. and S.B." 1853. The locket and its contents were donated to the New Orleans Historical Society, where they remained on display until 1941, when they were removed from public view at the request of descendants of the Beaumont family. Their current whereabouts are unknown. Perhaps the most disturbing epilogue to this narrative comes from an unexpected source. In 1902, a man named James Ellis published a brief memoir in a Philadelphia newspaper claiming to be the son of Elijah Grant and Amelia Beaumont. Ellis, then in his late 40s, stated that he had been taken north by members of the Underground Railroad after being sold to Mississippi and had been raised by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. Ellis's account contained details about the Beaumont residence that historians have confirmed could only have been known by someone familiar with the house or through detailed second-hand accounts. He claimed to possess the letter written by Amelia Beaumont on the night of her death passed to him through a chain of individuals connected to Reverend Whitaker. Ellis wrote that the letter contained a full confession of Beaumont's actions, as well as her express wish that her son should one day know that in her final hours she recognized the grave injustice she had committed in treating her own flesh and blood as property to be disposed of. Historians and archivists remain divided on the authenticity of Ellis's claims. No conclusive evidence has emerged to either confirm or refute his assertion that he was the infant Samuel. What remains undisputed, however, are the official records documenting Amelia Beaumont's pregnancy, the birth of a child, the fraudulent attribution of that child to an enslaved woman, and the subsequent attempt to sell the child into slavery. The case of Amelia Beaumont and Elijah Grant stands as a stark illustration of the profound moral contradictions inherent in the institution of American slavery, a system that not only permitted the commodification of human beings, but created conditions in which even the most intimate human connections could be distorted by the brutal logic of property and ownership. To this day, some residents of New Orleans claim that 24 Bourbon Street remains haunted by the echoes of its past. Night watchmen and passers-by have reported hearing the sound of a woman weeping or glimpsing the figure of a woman in 19th century dress standing at an upstairs window looking out as if searching for someone long lost. Whether one gives credence to such accounts or not, what cannot be disputed is that within those walls, a woman once made the unfathomable decision to sell her own child rather than face the social consequences of having crossed the rigid boundaries of race and class that defined her world. In doing so, she embodied the darkest contradictions of a society built upon human bondage, contradictions that would eventually tear a nation apart. The 50-year seal placed on Amelia Beaumont's final letter expired in 1904. By that time, Reverend Whitaker had long since passed away, and St. Louis Cathedral had suffered significant damage during the Civil War. Church archives from that period are incomplete, and despite extensive searches by historians, the letter has never been found. Like so many voices from that troubled era, Amelia Beaumont's final testimony has been lost to time, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered. However, in 1971, during the restoration of St. Louis Cathedral, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had once been Reverend Whitaker's office. Inside was a small tin box containing several documents that had apparently been concealed there sometime before the Civil War. Among these papers was a sealed envelope bearing Amelia Beaumont's distinctive handwriting. Whether this was the infamous final letter or some other communication remains a matter of debate among historians, as the church authorities immediately transferred the documents to a private collection without allowing scholars to examine them. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, a historian specializing in antebellum New Orleans society, claimed in a 1977 monograph that she had been granted brief access to these documents and had viewed what appeared to be a confession written by Amelia Beaumont. According to Dr. Kane, the letter confirmed the relationship between Beaumont and Grant, but also contained allegations that Grant had been manipulating Beaumont from the beginning with the intention of securing his own freedom and that of his child. Kane's account has been disputed by other scholars, and without access to the original documents, the truth remains elusive. What we do know with certainty comes from the journal of Dr. Edward Sinclair, discovered among his papers after his death in 1867. In entries he never intended for public view, Sinclair described the birth of Amelia Beaumont's child in clinical detail, noting that the infant bears unmistakable evidence of its mixed parentage, though not so pronounced as to immediately draw notice from casual observers. He further recorded that Miss Beaumont had initially shown appropriate maternal affection toward the child, but had grown increasingly distressed as the reality of her situation became clear. Most revealing was Sinclair's entry from March 1853, in which he wrote, "Miss B confided to me today her growing terror that her secret will be discovered." The child's features, initially indistinct as with all newborns, have begun to resolve themselves into a countenance that bears marked resemblance to the father. She speaks of hearing whispers among the household staff and imagines accusatory glances from the few visitors she still receives. I have prescribed laudanum to calm her nerves, though I fear she may be developing a dependence on the preparation. This entry provides a glimpse into the psychological deterioration that Amelia Beaumont experienced as she attempted to maintain her deception. The pressure of concealing not only the child's existence but also its parentage clearly took a devastating toll on her mental state. In this light, the decision to attribute the child to Lydia and then sell both mother and child appears less as a cold, calculated act and more as a desperate attempt by a woman trapped within the rigid constraints of her society and her own mounting paranoia. Mary Thompson, the enslaved cook in the Beaumont household, provided additional insights into the psychological dynamics at play during this period. In testimony given after Beaumont's death, Thompson described how Miss Amelia would sometimes sit for hours in the nursery holding the child and weeping. Other times she would refuse to look at it for days, ordering Lydia to keep it out of her sight and hearing. Her mood swung like a pendulum from tender to terrified to cruel. Thompson also recounted a particularly disturbing incident that occurred in September 1853, approximately 5 months after the child's birth. Miss Amelia had the child brought to the dining room during an evening when she had invited Reverend Whitaker to dine. She presented the infant as Lydia's child and watched the Reverend's face intently as he blessed the child. Later that night I heard her pacing in her room repeating over and over, "He knows. God help me." I could see it in his eyes. He knows. This incident suggests that Beaumont's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she was testing the effectiveness of her deception, perhaps unconsciously seeking either reassurance that her secret remained hidden or absolution through discovery. The fact that she chose a man of the cloth as the subject of this test indicates the degree to which her actions had become entangled with questions of moral and spiritual judgment. Reverend Whitaker's own diary, portions of which were published by the Louisiana Historical Society in 1931, contains oblique references to the Beaumont situation. In an entry dated October 14, 1853, Whitaker wrote, "Visited the Beaumont household today. The lady of the house appears increasingly agitated and speaks in circles about divine judgment and the inheritance of sin. I fear for her spiritual well-being, but am constrained by the seal of confidence from seeking additional counsel on her behalf. I can only continue to direct her toward Scripture and prayer, though I question whether she truly seeks redemption or merely relief from her conscience." The relationship between Amelia Beaumont and Elijah Grant remains perhaps the most complex and ambiguous aspect of this narrative. The power dynamic between enslaver and enslaved fundamentally precludes the possibility of genuine consent or balanced emotional exchange. Yet the testimony of household servants suggests something more nuanced than simple coercion occurred between them. Eliza Davis, the laundress, testified that Miss Amelia and Elijah often spoke together in low voices in the library. Sometimes I would hear them laughing. Other times there would be heated words, though always too quiet to make out clearly. He had ways of moving in that house that no other enslaved person would dare entering rooms without knocking, speaking without being spoken to first. This unusual degree of familiarity and apparent autonomy granted to Grant suggests that the relationship had evolved beyond the typical boundaries that governed interactions between white women and enslaved men in antebellum New Orleans. Whether this represented a genuine emotional connection, a calculated manipulation on Grant's part to improve his condition, or some complex combination of the two, remains impossible to determine with certainty. What is clear is that Grant possessed a degree of literacy and worldliness unusual for an enslaved person of that era. The letter found in his possession when he attempted to flee was written in what court records described as an educated hand with sophisticated vocabulary and grammatical construction. This suggests that Grant had received education well beyond what was typically permitted for enslaved individuals, for whom literacy was often actively discouraged or legally prohibited. The question of how and why Elijah Grant came to be purchased by Amelia Beaumont in the first place remains one of the most intriguing aspects of this case. Court records indicate that Grant had previously been owned by Colonel Robert Caldwell of Mobile, who had employed him as a personal manservant. During the investigation following Beaumont's death, investigators attempted to interview Colonel Caldwell regarding Grant's character and background, only to discover that Caldwell had died 3 months after selling Grant to the Beaumont household. Caldwell's widow, however, provided a statement that raised further questions. According to her testimony, Elijah Grant had been a troublesome influence in our household and had been sold after Colonel Caldwell discovered him attempting to ingratiate himself with female members of the family. She further claimed that Grant had ideas above his station and had once been caught reading books from her husband's library without permission. What makes this testimony particularly interesting is that it suggests Grant may have established a pattern of seeking relationships with white women in positions of power or influence over him. Whether this represented a genuine romantic or sexual preference, or a calculated strategy for improving his circumstances, is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Grant possessed both the intelligence and the interpersonal skills to navigate the dangerous social terrain of the antebellum South with a degree of agency unusual for an enslaved person. The question of how Amelia Beaumont became aware of Grant's existence and decided to purchase him specifically has never been definitively answered. However, a letter discovered in the papers of Sophia Harrington offers a tantalizing clue. Written in June 1852, approximately 1 month before Beaumont purchased Grant, the letter mentions that Miss Beaumont was quite taken with the handsome manservant who attended Colonel Caldwell at the Simpson wedding breakfast. She inquired most particularly about his background and training. I thought little of it at the time, assuming she sought to improve the quality of her own household staff. But in light of subsequent events, one wonders if her interest was of a more personal nature from the very beginning. If this account is accurate, it suggests that the initial attraction may have been Beaumont's, and that she deliberately sought out Grant after their first encounter. This inverts the traditional narrative of the enslaved man as predator or seducer of white feminine virtue that was propagated by some of Beaumont's defenders after the scandal broke. The conception and birth of the child that would be named Samuel represents the physical embodiment of the boundary crossing that occurred within the Beaumont household. Dr. Sinclair's medical logs indicate that the pregnancy progressed normally, though he noted that Miss B displays none of the common maternal anticipation one typically observes in women of her station. She speaks of the child as a problem to be managed rather than a blessing to be welcomed. The birth itself, which occurred on April 12, 1853, was attended by Dr. Sinclair and a midwife named Ruth, an enslaved woman borrowed from a neighboring household specifically for this purpose. According to later testimony, Ruth was returned to her owners immediately after the birth and was sold to a plantation in Florida within the week. Another loose end tidily eliminated from the narrative Beaumont was constructing, the decision to attribute the child to Lydia appears to have been made well in advance of the birth. Mary Thompson testified that Lydia was kept largely confined to her quarters for several months before the child was born, with meals brought to her. When anyone from outside the household called, it was mentioned that Lydia was in a delicate condition. Meanwhile, Miss Amelia remained largely in her rooms, claiming to suffer from nervous exhaustion that required complete rest. This careful choreography suggests a level of premeditation that complicates any attempt to view Amelia Beaumont merely as a victim of circumstances or her own emotions. The deliberate construction of a false narrative around the child's parentage, involving the effective imprisonment of Lydia and the manipulation of social expectations, demonstrates a calculated approach to preserving Beaumont's social position at the expense of those she held in bondage. The period between the child's birth and the decision to sell both Lydia and the infant represents perhaps the most psychologically complex chapter of this narrative. Mary Wilson, an enslaved housemaid, described finding Miss Amelia seated in the nursery in the middle of the night, holding the child, and singing lullabies, tears streaming down her face. On other occasions, Beaumont would fly into a rage if the child was brought into her presence, ordering Lydia to remove it immediately and keep it quiet, as though the very sight and sound of it was unbearable to her. These dramatic mood swings suggest a profound ambivalence toward the child, a simultaneous emotional connection to it, as her offspring, and a horror of what its existence represented in terms of her transgression of social and racial boundaries. Household servants testified to Beaumont's erratic behavior during these months, alternating between periods of intense maternal attention to the child and episodes of what appeared to be disgust or rejection. This psychological conflict appears to have intensified as the child developed, and as Dr. Sinclair noted, began to display features that more clearly indicated its mixed parentage. The decision to sell the child alongside Lydia as its purported mother appears to have crystallized sometime in early October 1853. This timing coincides with Beaumont's visit to the law offices of Caldwell and Associates, suggesting that she sought legal advice regarding the sale. George Caldwell's later testimony that he advised against the scheme but that Beaumont proceeded anyway indicates her growing desperation to resolve the increasingly untenable situation in which she found herself. The actual mechanics of the sale reveal the extent to which the human trafficking system of American slavery facilitated Beaumont's attempt to erase her transgression. The advertisement placed in the New Orleans Courier presented Lydia and the infant as a package, a common practice in slave sales that often had the effect of preserving family units, however perversely, within a system designed to treat human beings as property. The high price paid by William Hargrove, $1,000 for a domestic servant and infant, has been interpreted by historians as indicating that Hargrove understood he was purchasing something more than mere labor. The term fancy sale, used in some contemporary accounts of the transaction, was a euphemism in the slave trade for the sale of enslaved women who were intended for sexual exploitation by their purchasers. Whether Hargrove's interest was in Lydia, the unusual-looking infant, or both remains a matter of speculation. What is clear is that the sale was designed to remove both Lydia and the child from New Orleans, effectively eliminating the physical evidence of Beaumont's transgression. The choice of a buyer from Jefferson Parish, some 60 miles distant from New Orleans, ensured that the child would be unlikely to be observed by members of Beaumont's social circle as it grew older and its features became more distinct. The unraveling of this carefully constructed scheme began with Elijah Grant's attempted escape in November 1853. The timing of this attempt, coming just weeks after the sale of Lydia and the child, suggests that Grant may have been motivated by concern for his offspring's fate. The substantial sum of money found in his possession, $250, raises questions about its source. Could Amelia Beaumont have provided these funds perhaps as compensation or inducement for his silence? Or had Grant been slowly accumulating this money through some other means, biding his time until he could make his escape? The letter addressed to the New York Anti-Slavery Society found in Grant's possession represents the most direct evidence of his perspective on the events that had transpired. According to court records, the letter provided a detailed account of his relationship with Amelia Beaumont, the birth of their child, and the subsequent deception regarding its parentage. Most significantly, the letter requested that the society attempt to locate and purchase the freedom of my son Samuel, sold alongside the woman Lydia to William Hargrove of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. This explicit acknowledgement of paternity, along with the attempt to secure the child's freedom, suggests that Grant felt some degree of paternal responsibility toward the infant. This complicates the narrative of Grant as merely a calculating manipulator, using the relationship with Beaumont as a means to secure his own advantage. The willingness to risk his chance of escape by carrying such incriminating documentation indicates the depth of his concern for the child's welfare. Amelia Beaumont's reaction to Grant's attempted escape, as recorded in the jailer's log, suggests a sense of betrayal. The heated exchange witnessed by the jailer, followed by Beaumont's formal accusations against Grant, paints a picture of a woman lashing out in fear and anger at the man whose actions threatened to expose her most closely guarded secret. The accusations themselves, theft and attempted assault, were clearly fabricated, designed to ensure that Grant would face the harshest possible punishment and would not be believed if he attempted to reveal the truth about their relationship and the child. In the context of antebellum Louisiana, such accusations against an enslaved man by a white woman of standing would typically have been accepted without question, leading to severe punishment or execution. The intervention of George Caldwell, the attorney who had advised Beaumont against her scheme to sell the child, represents a remarkable breach of the solidarity typically shown by white society in matters involving racial boundaries and the system of slavery. Caldwell's testimony that Beaumont had consulted him regarding a child born to a white woman but claimed to be born to an enslaved woman directly contradicted Beaumont's narrative and lent credibility to Grant's account. What motivated Caldwell to come forward remains unclear. In his testimony, he claimed to be acting out of professional ethics and Christian conscience, but some historians have suggested that other factors may have been at play. Records indicate that Caldwell's law firm had represented the Beaumont family for decades, managing their business affairs and property transactions. The decision to publicly contradict and potentially destroy the reputation of a long-standing client would not have been taken lightly. Whatever his motivations, Caldwell's testimony transformed what might have been a routine case of an enslaved person's attempted escape into a scandal that threatened to expose the hypocrisies and contradictions at the heart of New Orleans' social order. The investigation, ordered by Judge Benjamin Foster himself, a member of the planter class with a vested interest in maintaining the system of slavery, suggests the degree to which Beaumont's actions were viewed as a threat to established social boundaries. The medical examination that confirmed the presence of the distinctive birthmark on the infant's shoulder, matching one on Elijah Grant, provided physical evidence that supported Grant's claims of paternity. This physical marker, passed down through Grant's maternal line according to his letter, represented an indelible sign of the child's ancestry that could not be erased or obscured through Beaumont's elaborate deceptions. Dr. Sinclair's confirmation under oath that he had delivered Amelia Beaumont's child and had been paid to maintain silence on the matter completed the collapse of the narrative she had constructed. The physician's testimony, coming from a respected member of New Orleans' professional society, carried particular weight and could not be dismissed as the fabrications of a desperate enslaved man seeking to escape punishment. The legal and social fallout from these revelations was immediate and devastating. The New Orleans Crescent's description of the case as a scandal unparalleled in the recent history of our society understates the profound shock that rippled through New Orleans' upper classes. The case touched on the deepest anxieties of white Southern society. The fear of racial mixing, the potential for enslaved men to exert agency, even within a system designed to deny it to them, and the capacity for white women, the symbolic repositories of racial purity and social virtue, to transgress the very boundaries they were meant to embody. The division of New Orleans society in response to the scandal reveals the extent to which the case threatened established social narratives. Those who withdrew support from Amelia Beaumont entirely were acknowledging the gravity of her transgression against the racial order. Those who closed ranks around her, suggesting that she had been corrupted and coerced by Elijah Grant, were attempting to preserve the fiction of white female vulnerability and black male predation that underpinned so much of the ideology justifying slavery. The legal questions raised by the case, particularly regarding the status of the infant Samuel, represented a fundamental challenge to the system of property rights that defined American slavery. If the child was legally free by virtue of having been born to a free white woman, then its subsequent sale constituted not merely fraud, but a form of kidnapping or false imprisonment. Yet acknowledging this legal reality would require the courts to recognize and legitimize the product of a relationship that the entire social order was constructed to prevent and condemn. Amelia Beaumont's suicide on February 6, 1854, provided a convenient resolution to these legal contradictions. With her death, the primary witness and perpetrator of the alleged crimes was removed from the equation, allowing the case to be quietly set aside without the need to address its more troubling implications for the legal and social system. The sealed letter addressed to Reverend Whitaker, found beside Beaumont's body, represents one of the most tantalizing loose ends in this narrative. The decision to place it under seal for 50 years suggests that its contents were considered too sensitive or damaging to be made public in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. By the time the seal was set to expire in 1904, most of the individuals directly involved in the case would have been deceased, and the social and legal context would have been transformed by the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. The fate of Elijah Grant, sold to a consortium of merchants and transported to Liberia, represents another attempt to remove a problematic element from the narrative. The American Colonization Society's resettlement program, which transported formerly enslaved people to the colony of Liberia in West Africa, was often presented as a humanitarian initiative, but frequently served as a means of removing free black individuals whose very existence challenged the racial hierarchies of American society. The disappearance of Lydia and the infant Samuel into the vast system of American chattel slavery in Mississippi illustrates the ease with which human beings could be made to vanish within this system. their identities and histories erased as they were bought, sold, and transported across state lines. William Hargrove's decision to sell them shortly after purchasing them suggests his awareness of the legal complexities surrounding the child's status and his desire to avoid becoming entangled in the scandal. The discovery of the hidden locket in 1904 containing portraits of Amelia Beaumont and the infant with the inscription, "My heart divided against itself," provides a poignant glimpse into the emotional reality behind the legal and social narrative. The choice of words suggests that Beaumont experienced her feelings for the child as a form of internal conflict, a division between her natural maternal attachment and the social imperatives that demanded she reject and conceal that attachment. The removal of the locket from public display in 1941 at the request of Beaumont family descendants indicates the lingering power of the scandal to affect reputations even decades after the events themselves. The desire to control the narrative around Beaumont's actions and to limit public access to physical evidence of her transgression demonstrates how deeply the case continued to resonate with questions of family honor and social standing. The emergence of James Ellis in 1902 claiming to be the son of Elijah Grant and Amelia Beaumont represents yet another twist in this complex narrative. Ellis's claim to possess Amelia Beaumont's final letter, in which she allegedly expressed remorse for having treated her own flesh and blood as property to be disposed of, suggests that she may have experienced a moral reckoning in her final hours. Whether Ellis was indeed the infant Samuel somehow rescued from slavery and raised in Pennsylvania cannot be definitively proven. The details he provided about the Beaumont residence, which historians confirmed could only have been known by someone familiar with the house, lend some credibility to his account. However, such information could potentially have been obtained through other means, including conversations with individuals who had been connected to the case. What remains clear is that the case of Amelia Beaumont and Elijah Grant continues to resonate as a powerful illustration of the human costs of the system of American slavery and the racial ideologies that supported it. Within this system, even the most intimate human connections between lovers, between mother and child, were distorted by the brutal logic of property and racial hierarchy. The reports of supernatural occurrences at 24 Bourbon Street, the weeping woman, the figure at the window represent the transformation of historical trauma into folklore, a process by which communities attempt to process and make sense of events that challenge their fundamental understanding of social order. Whether one gives credence to such accounts or not, they speak to the lasting impact of Amelia Beaumont's actions on the collective memory of New Orleans. In the end, what makes the case of Amelia Beaumont and Elijah Grant so disturbing is not merely the transgression of social boundaries that it represents, but the light it sheds on the moral contradictions inherent in the society that produced it. A system that defined human beings as property created the conditions under which a mother could sell her own child, rather than acknowledge its existence. A society built upon rigid racial hierarchies created the context in which love or desire across those hierarchies became not merely forbidden, but unthinkable. The true horror of this narrative lies not in any supernatural element or graphic depiction of violence, but in the human capacity to compartmentalize, to divide the heart against itself in service of social convention and personal advantage. It is a horror that continues to echo in American society today, as we reckon with the long shadows cast by the institution of slavery and the ideologies of racial difference that sustained it. As for 24 Bourbon Street, the property changed hands numerous times in the decades following the scandal. By the mid-20th century, it had been converted into a museum of New Orleans history, with no mention in its official literature of the events that had unfolded within its walls in 1852 and 1853. Only in 1977, as part of a broader movement toward a more honest reckoning with the city's complex past, was an exhibit installed that acknowledged the Beaumont Grant case. Today, the house stands as a silent witness to a chapter in American history that many would prefer to forget. A chapter that reveals how systems of oppression corrupt not only those who are oppressed, but also those who benefit from the oppression. The case of Amelia Beaumont and Elijah Grant reminds us that the most profound horrors are not those that can be easily relegated to the realm of superstition or fantasy, but those that emerge from the darker corners of human nature when shaped by unjust social systems. As the evening shadows lengthen across Bourbon Street, one might imagine Amelia Beaumont still standing at that upstairs window, searching the horizon for something forever lost to her. her child, her moral compass, or perhaps the person she might have become in a different society, one that did not require her to choose between her heart and her place in the world. If this story of hidden secrets, betrayal, and the brutal realities of antebellum America left you as shaken as it did me, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten tales from history's shadows. Drop a comment below. What do you think drove Amelia to such extremes? And share this video to keep these important stories alive. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.